So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Kathy Peretta, Vice President in Ipsos's Marketing Strategy team. Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Assad and I as we take a look into the future. I think a future for many of us that is, most of us would have anticipated that we would have by now been in the post-pandemic era. But with the most recent changes and emergence of more virulent infections, we really have to question whether or not there's going to be an eradication of the COVID-19 virus. In fact, of late, many experts, like our top doc in Ontario, Dr. Kieran Moore, our Ontario's Chief Medical Officer, is predicting that even though most of the country is in the midst of reopening plans and we are hitting our vaccination targets well ahead of schedule, really best-in-class results, we are more likely to move from a pandemic era into an endemic era. And what actually do I mean by that? What actually is an endemic era? Well, the CDC defines endemic as the usual prevalence of a disease or an infectious agent in a population within a geographic area. So looking ahead, I think what we can really expect are infection pop-up shops globally. Now, it's undoubtedly, we've made astounding progress thus far, and we have a concise plan really to combat future infections. But I think that most of us can agree, given the latest events, that we are likely to remain in a period of uncertainty, or if you will, a transition period. So as we continue our slow pivot from managing the COVID-19 infection to a recovery or reopening of our economies, the data is really clear. The experience has had a profound impact on people's habits and behaviors. And I think even more importantly, this infection and the period of contagion or isolation, the economic uncertainty, has left an indelible imprint on the consumer psyche that is likely to influence change for many years to come. Certainly, these rapid shifts have had important implications for the food and beverage industry. And so I think looking ahead, success is going to demand not only a commitment, but a rigor to being future focused. At Ipsos, we're really committed to helping our clients find sustainable growth in these turbulent times, arming them with insights that really aid in building flexible action plans that are adaptable to the ever-changing world that we see transpiring around us, and really fueled by consumer behavior. And we look to do that through the power of future casting. So over the next 40 minutes or so, Assad and I are going to be sharing out with you what actually is future casting. We want to give you a basic understanding of how we do it. And we wanted you to consider why it's important in this very competitive landscape to your future performance. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some data. So we're going to look at some of the pandemic trend highlights. And really what I mean by that is trends that have accelerated during the pandemic period. And then we're going to give you two business case examples, one that focuses on retail and food consumption or food behavior sourced from retail. And the second one is going to look at food service coffee. And then Assad is going to leave you with some closing thoughts. So what is future casting? And in a nutshell, it is a strategic planning tool with outputs that provide visions, or, if you will, situations of what the future could be. It's far more than just a numeric forecast. The outputs include three main components. The first one is a quantitative change that behavior will have looking out into the future. The second component is an identification of the change signals. And what do I mean by that? Well, these are the factors that have been most predictive to the change that we've seen in the 17 months that we've been in the pandemic versus the pre-pandemic period. Those two factors combine into allowing us to create scenario or what if simulations. Now, as we find ourselves in the midst of this transition period, the future casting outputs allow us to plan for where the future can take us. Now, we know that future casting is not an absolute prediction because ultimately the future reality could differ vastly from what any of us could have ever imagined. And certainly the past 17 months have showed us that. Even the past 3 months have shown us that. But future casting does give us the future path, an opportunity to see consumer habits, needs, and how those shifts impact category or brand performance, channel performance, the cohort needs, and really reveal specific insights and shifts that regardless of how the future evolves will be relevant to business questions that our clients are asking us. A really solid foundation for creating a game plan for the future. So how do we do this? Well, we leverage machine-based learning for this initiative. And we also engaged the Global Ipsos Network, which is a combination of world-class resources, the brightest minds anywhere, and the newest capabilities to address our clients' questions around what the future will hold for them. To create the future casting model, we recruited Shufeng Wang. He's on the line with us today, and he really is a brilliant PhD. And he's the senior vice president who leads our data sciences team. He and his talented colleagues created a customized machine-based learning model for our future casting outputs for Canada. In tandem with the newly developed models, we've also added, and very important to note, time-ordered behavioral data. This time-ordered data is captured daily from 2 syndicated services at Ipsos, our 5 study and our food service monitor study. And these 2 tracking studies evaluate behavior on both sides of the market, retail and food service. This ongoing online diary has been in place since 2014, and it captures behaviors and needs and situations and purchase habits among over 50,000 Canadian individuals annually. This is really an unparalleled view of eating and drinking, available only at Ipsos, and the multiple data points that we get from these syndicated services allow us to have forecasting confidence in the modeling that we create for the future. There's also other benefits. Certainly, the ability to see behavior on both sides of the market is absolutely paramount, whether you're in the food service industry or vested in a retail channel. Having that visibility is absolutely critical, and the work we've done thus far has really proven that. Our 365-day-a-year tracking really allows for accommodation of seasonality into the model, very important for certain categories and brands. The ongoing tracking also allows us to identify the change signals, which is really critical. And that's because we can understand what was and what is currently, and what are the key factors that have been most predictive to that change. We're also able to measure future change with ongoing tracking, so that will be another component moving forward as we evolve through this change dynamic. The team itself, a wealth of experience. We work in behavioral tracking every single day that we are in the workplace environment. And finally, because the data is in place, it often offers timely and very cost-effective solutions compared to some of the competitors in the marketplace. So how do we do this? Let's review a simple, and this isn't simple, but in order to communicate a baseline understanding, let's look at a 3-step process. The first step in the framework is through regression type techniques, we model long-term behavior to create a moving average. So what you see in front of you is annual change for a particular category, looking back to 2017 and out to June 2021. Then we add a series of regressors to the model that impacts the moving average. So one of the factors we could add would be seasonality change. And this looks at the seasonal dynamics. And you can see for this category, there's higher consumption in the winter months. Consumption drops into the summer months and picks up again as we head into the fall and winter period. Now that trend line remains fairly consistent until we see a spike between April and April time period in 2020. And so that's a disruption to the moving average. And then what we do is we investigate what factors, either internal to our data sets, but it could even be external data that's added, what factors are most predictive to that disruption or that change. The next step is in identifying what those signals are. And the example I'm giving you here has been leveraged through our internal syndicated sources. And these factors are working from home, influenced that change in the moving average. A quest for more relaxation, a higher demand for things that addressed stress. We also saw that there was more inclusion in meals, and that really drove change for this particular category. And then finally, we noted in the data that consumers were increasingly choosing this category to meet a variety of physical needs. So think things like energy, gut health, may even be looking for things that bolstered their immune system. So when we look at all of those signals in combination, step 3 is applying that signal veracity to the moving average to project out forecasts. And so in scenario 1, it would mean that the signals that were most predictive to the change were still very high, perhaps much like they are today. And that would result in a 5% growth in servings. If in scenario 2, the factors were still in play, but not as strongly impacting the behavioral dynamics as they were in the current trajectory, that would only result in a 2% growth in savings. And then scenario 3, where the factors may still be in play, but their veracity or strength in impacting behavior much lower, would result in a 0.5% decline in servings from the current period. Now, why do we do this forecasting and why is it so critical? And I think you can see just by the example that it is not just about a numeric forecast. One of the key opportunities is to be able to wipe out all the noise and focus on the core signals that are really going to give you the best bang for your buck. So really improving that signal to noise ratio. There are many other benefits, and we'll just address a few of them. So looking forward, one of the key elements and benefits, which has applications across multiple facets in a business, whether it's marketing or sales, shelf assortment, your menu mix. But one of the key benefits is augmenting the pandemic understanding and really identifying what has been transforming needs and habits. Of course, this is really important, not only to communicate internally within your business, but also to communicate, to add into your communication in marketing initiatives, to share with retailers, to be best in class in thought leadership, but also can impact, again, that shelf assortment or menu mix. Then there's the opportunity to evaluate behavioral stickiness. And stickiness is one of those buzzwords in this period, but really how we evaluate behavioral stickiness, because we know the pandemic changes are not linear. We look at future habits sticking based on the satisfaction that consumers have with the habits. So although we may have gone into the pandemic holding our nose at something, now we want to evaluate, has there been a time benefit, a financial benefit, a benefit in needs? So that would be the evaluation of the satisfaction with the change. And we couple that together with what will be the fit in future routines. So behavioral stickiness is equal to satisfaction and fit in future routines. And that has lots of applications, but think about how you could apply it to the innovation, your innovation pipeline or innovation potential in the future. Of course, we're in a transition period. Long-term behaviors have not yet been formed. So this is a really important opportunity to shape the future. And depending on how your results have performed during the pandemic period, you may be looking to shift behavior. So if you're in the food service industry and you see incidence numbers growing, but your results still behind pre-pandemic rates, maybe you need to drive a frequency strategy. So the planning becomes very tactical in how you can shape the future. And then finally, and I think this is most important, understanding behavioral dynamics triangulated with things like sales data really help you to set feasible and achievable goals. And that is not only important to communicate with your customers. Nobody wants to be left with lots of unsold items on the shelf that can really hurt your trade spend. But I think it's also important to communicate within the organization, whether it's to your leadership team or whether it's leadership teams communicating to global leadership. So really setting feasible and achievable goals is another key usage. So as we look at the change signals, I just wanted to give you a visual image of why our data sets are so critical to the change signal barometer. First, what's really important is looking back into the past at the behavioral dynamics and adding that into the modeling. And two factors are important. One are the size and the veracity of the market trends. The other one that's important is the category or the brand momentum that the product had before heading into the pandemic period. Then when we get into the pandemic period, we're just going to look at what trends have accelerated and how that impacts the forecast, looking at those behavioral shifts, understanding whether it's habit and routine. The past work that we've done has revealed that the more habitual and routine a behavior is to your daily consumption patterns, or in other words, how often do I do this, the less subject it is to change. So the less subject it is to that elastic band approach. And then the situational dynamics are also evaluated, and all these culled together can be used to identify those signals. And then once again, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about time series modeling, as we look out, understanding that high impact are largely closer into the pandemic period, the medium impact of the signal strength further out from the pandemic period. So think a year to 2 years from now, and then low impact, less impact, the signals have less veracity or force, would be a low impact signal. So think of that as we go through the examples. So let's first start with the pandemic trends, and undoubtedly there have been a lot of macro factors that have influenced or shaped consumer dynamics. Some of the accelerating trends that we're looking at, from a lot of the work that we do within the trend space are evaluating out of home. So of course that food service is critical, understand the dynamics of working from home, vaccine status, and how will that impact the out of home habits that we had in the pre-pandemic period. Understanding health, of course, it moves beyond just solely nutrient and nourishment factors, but also looking at those physical benefits I mentioned earlier, things like immunity and energy and digestion and sleep, emotional well-being, looking for comfort and de-stress. Conscious consumption habits. We once had this part of health in a societal health lens, but because it's become so important, it's a pillar unto itself. We're investigating environment, animal welfare, the connection to plant-based eating, waste, safety and hygiene, likely a critical factor moving forward. Convenience continues to be influencing consumers' choices. Pantry loading is a big up and coming factor in redefining convenience. Of course, values are evolving. We've moved from that seek and search the next latest and greatest to retreat and cocooning. We have personal manifestos, eating alone, and product provenance, where things come, how authentic are they, how premium are they. Finally, online, really important, whether that is seeking and searching information, shopping online, and the available expanding sources that consumers have at their fingertips to vet their choices. And home habits, work, school, socializing, preparation, all factor in to trends that have accelerated and that we are evaluating. And just a little plug for our annual trends report, the 8th edition, near and dear to my heart, coming out December 2021, which will really peel apart all of these big picture factors. So look for that coming soon to you. Now, as we move into the future casting case studies, we've focused on really two specific business examples, as I mentioned earlier, but the application of future casting is wide and it's vast and it's varied. Not only does it move beyond categories and brands, we can look at specific behaviors and cohorts and different channel dynamics. But envision yourself in this fit, whether it's from milk to wine, from plant-based burgers to sandwiches, from delivery services to barbecuing, movie theaters to beer. How about YAMPs, those young, educated millennial parents? We love to talk about them. Maybe rising in a particular multicultural group or multicultural cuisine, and you want to understand the future of that. Really, the potential is endless. So consider yourself and your business questions as we go through these case studies. So the first case study that we're going to talk about really looks at the macro level and evaluating how eating behaviors of items sourced from retail may change as we look out in the future. And this is really critical because we know that the mandated closure of food service, the benefit has accrued to many brands and retailers within the overall retail sector, though everybody has not been impacted equally. So really important to understand this dynamic. So just to set the environmental situation, some background. So now we see that nearly 9 in 10 consumption occasions are sourced from a retail outlet. And if we look to the pre-pandemic era, that split was more like an 80-20 split. Now that's occasion splits, not dollar split. In a dollar split ratio pre-pandemic, it would have been more a 70-30 split. We also see that consumers are having fewer weekly shopping trips, mandated as well, more planned occasions. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a big shift in needs. So rather than being out there and exploring the next new cuisine and needing to find the next latest and greatest. Consumers have retreated and cocooned and are now looking at comfort and nostalgia. So if we look at that step one, let's look at those linear behavioral changes. And so here we can see a distribution of occasions from 2015 right forward to 2021, our current period ending June. And we can see the 80-20 split and how retail and food service in an occasion share shift are distributed between that period. Of course, when we get to that pandemic period at early 2020, you see that lift for retail, and you see that decline for food service. And though the numbers have changed somewhat, if we look to March 2021, we still see a decline in dollars at 32% and a decline in traffic at 32% in the food service channel. Now, our latest data for the period ending July shows some improvement, but still food service remains well behind where it was in the pre-pandemic period. So if we take a more granular look at the distribution at retail of occasions over the time period to create that moving average, we can see that retail between 2015 and 2016 saw some nice growth in development. And then we saw that slow movement of habits away from home to food service between 2016 and really right through to just before 2020. And then we see where there's that sharp spike upward in early 2020. And what the red line would show you is if all things remained unchanged, that would be the future growth and development in retail. But of course we know that there are factors and they're not going to remain as strong as they are today in signal strength. And so that's where we add those to the red line to get the forecast, changing the current trajectory. One of the other things that we add as a regressor that I mentioned earlier was looking at seasonality. So if you focus on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that in a pre-COVID lens, that there's a bump early on in the year. That's the period between January and March where we've all lived our greatest life in the holiday season, and now we're looking to reset. So we are cooking more often and planning more often. And then you see how we fall off the bandwagon pre-COVID. And there is less consumption during the period, the summer months, and then a little bit bump back up as we go into the end of the year. Now, COVID changed that slightly. And what it did was it flattened out the line so that there's not such a movement. It's a flatter line than it would have been in the pre-COVID period. So of course, that gets added to the model. In tandem with that change, we've got to look at our signals. And so some of the signals that we've identified as critical to driving growth for the retail sector are home nesting routines. So again, as I mentioned, that retreat home for work, for school, and for social life in the midst of an uncertain environment. So home nesting routines. More solo and less social. While the early pandemic days resulted in somewhat of a return to the table, our ingrained routines and habit during the majority of the pandemic period reveal much more solo consumption. And then finally, another key signal was the on-demand availability. So increased pantry loading and the redefining of convenience. 34% of consumers report increasingly pantry loading items when compared to the pre-pandemic period. So this is the definition of contemporary convenience. If signals that are most predictive to the retail sector remain highly influential to behavior, we're going to see a 3% growth in servings. 3%, that's growth on growth from what we've seen between 2020 and 21. If those signals have a medium impact, still in play, but less impactful when compared to current routines, a 1% growth. And if they have a low impact, still a growth, but only a 0.5% growth. So while all this information is really imperative to build that game plan for the future, it's also important within the game plan to have an action plan. And so some of the things that you might want to consider is when you have home nesting is quantifying those benefits. How much money are people saving? How much time are they saving? Make those benefits hard in your communication. If we see an increase in solo habits, consider the need for concise communication, not mass communication. So understanding that consumers see themselves as unique individuals with a personal manifesto. And so it's understanding that, and it's personalizing your communications and your solutions to the needs according to that personal manifesto. And then finally, when we look at meeting on-demand needs, it's ensuring that your products are at the right place, at the right time, with the right format to support those consumers who are increasingly reporting that they are pantry loading, and having those items on hand really meets those on-demand needs. So that's just an example of how, from a very high level, you can look at this information and put it into action. And so now I'm going to pass the baton over to Assad.
Thanks so much, Kathy. So my focus before we close is just to talk about another category. And this category picked because it was really heavily impacted by the pandemic. And that is basically around coffee. So coffee is an interesting case study as it straddles both in-home and out-of-home consumption. So if you think, okay, well, coffee is not relevant to me, don't switch off yet, because the point here is that you really need to understand two sides of the coin here, especially in light of what's been happening throughout the pandemic. So as Kathy's alluded to, consumers have been cocooning in home, morning commutes have been disrupted, and of course the food service industry has been particularly hard hit. And as you can see, coffee consumption is down as a result. Overall traffic is down double digits, and so are sales. Per capita is down 11. And coffee is very dependent on food service. 22% of all QSR menu items, coffee basically accounts for that much. So when you have a declining sector, there is to be some way of understanding of what's going on to really understand either how do you drive traffic back or really how has behavior changed. And that's why you need to set the target of understanding what is happening at retail. It's only when you uncover the important changes that have been taking place, you can really understand some of the opportunities that potentially might be around the corner. Now, when we look at the trend lines between coffee for food service and retail, you can see the gains made at retail has been kind of inevitably connected with the losses at food service. To my earlier point, if you look through a myopic universe of one industry, you're potentially missing out on insights on things that could be driving behavior changes right now. The coffee consumer of tomorrow could be very different from what they were like pre-pandemic. And we've already seen evidence of some of these changes even prior to the pandemic. So our data scientists, as Kathy mentioned, of course, use our behavioral information, which allowed us to look at all the changes that have been happening on a daily basis. But they've also incorporated information from various Reddit communities, and in this case within coffee, to kind of round out a lot of the trends we've been seeing. And they've seen chatter around coffee making equipment that's been steadily increasing even prior to the pandemic. So you can see Nespresso machines, AeroPress machines, grinders, all steadily growing. And of course, that's all spiked right at the pandemic. And if you compare that information to our daily tracking, we've seen this steadily change. Next slide, please, Kathy. And we've been observing a steady decline in coffee consumption and food service as well. So similarly, as you can see, even prior to the pandemic, there has been a slow movement towards in-home. And right now, this once-in-a-100-year event has simply accelerated it. And based on our future cast for the category, we indicate that if there's no changes to the signal strength, so everything remains as is, we potentially see a challenge for food service coffee because it is most likely going to be declining in the near term. And even if we look into seasonal factors, and we know coffee is a fairly seasonal category, you can see spikes around summer and winter periods, that is not going to make a difference at all in terms of what could happen around the corner for coffee. So inevitably, there is an uphill struggle for food service coffee unless you understand the triggers and signals derived from retail. You know, it's essential to understand how to drive traffic and mitigate any of the losses you've potentially seen. The top signals that you need to be mindful of, and out of many, of course, are that entire work from home movement. From our Global Essentials study, 86% of Canadians like working from home, and close to 80% actually expect their employees to allow them to do so. This comfortable and convenient habits that they've developed is unlikely to break in the near future, if ever. And the expectation is that there's going to be a larger portion of the population that is going to maintain working from home. So that is going to have a pretty big impact on a category that's dependent on a lot of morning traffic, especially office traffic. Morning declines, that particular focus on one occasion is potentially limiting, especially if those occasions are declining at food service. So what do you need to do to consider other opportunities outside of that? Do you even need to think about an occasion agnostic category if a category has been focused on one occasion in the past? And of course, millennials, everyone likes to talk about that sound bite. We've been talking about it forever, but there's a reason for it. They've been one of the primary drivers for growth in food service, and they really have changed the coffee landscape. Specialty iced coffee has been growing for a reason. Cold brews weren't even in our vocabulary 5 years ago. So these are things that you need to be mindful of as things progress. Now, in terms of how we see things change, if everything remains as is, now remember, coffee's been declining over this period, we still see some softening, maybe not to the same magnitude, but there is going to be an impact for food service. So again, it's ever more important to understand what's going on from the bigger picture point of view. Now, having said that, it's not all doom and gloom. If and when things do improve, if those signal strengths are more at a medium level, we potentially see an 8% growth. And of course, if everything goes down and the signals are dialed down to a fairly large level, then of course, we do expect double-digit growth just to return to the levels they were pre-pandemic. And what are the action points that you need to consider then, knowing that these are the signals to be mindful of for food service coffee? So hybrid work dynamics are important. You need to consider opportunities even for delivery for coffee. Sounds kind of extraordinary why you would order delivery for a cup of coffee, but it exists, it's available. Maybe have a short-term plan to mitigate the costs and offset the delivery fees. You have a new habit, you have new consumers, and an occasion that you can try and cater to. Maybe think of specialty coffee kits at home for those missing out on their espresso-based lattes. The frequency point Kathy spoke about, any type of tactical plan you can play in the near term. Think about multiple occasions. How do you get a return trip in the afternoon for somebody that actually ordered in the morning? Think about pairing opportunities with other foods. Maybe somebody might want to have an iced coffee after their lunch. The emotional enjoyment, again, speaks to those millennials. You want to tap into the coffee house experience. If people aren't able to go in, how do you encourage a way for people to kind of congregate, maybe virtually, because that's exactly what most of us have been doing. Maybe there's digital channels that you can take advantage of, or buy one, get one free offers that allow people to get multiple coffees for that same occasion. So as a closing, it's a very precarious time to make business decisions. You know, the level of uncertainty, even at the light at the end of the tunnel, is impalpable. So now is the time where you need a clear line of sight, or as clear as possible, on how to plan for the changes coming post-pandemic. You know, the window to understand or take advantage of some of these consumption trends that have transpired, they will get narrower. And it's imperative not just to understand it from one point of view. You need to understand both sides of the marketplace. For food service, you need to understand what's going on at retail. And for retail, you need to understand what's going on at food service. So it's been a pleasure sharing these pretty cool resources that we have on hand. It's powered by our suite of food and beverage products. You know, conversations do not cost a thing. You know, we have the knowledge and capabilities, and we want to help. So please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and we thank you for your time. So I believe there are some questions I think we can get on camera and have a look at what some of them are. So one of the questions is, what data do you use to feed into your forecasting model? So we've shared some prospectuses up front, and Kathy's mentioned the importance of our 5 and FSM consumption trackers. There's a lot of variables that we capture. You'll see that in the prospectus. The important thing here is we are able to do this every day of the year, and we've been doing it for close to a decade. So that level of granularity really allows us to understand potentially what's going to happen in terms of trends in the near future. In addition to that, if you want to use other sources, we've potentially expanding this into our other services, such as our alcohol consumption tracker. You want to look at sales, we have a level of flexibility if that's what you require. Another quick question is, can we run forecasts on the whole industry or on all categories, and can we pick and choose? So you have the ability to look at whatever you need to see as you see fit. So, you know, think of your business opportunity. We can focus on individual categories, or we can look at cohorts. We can look at different occasions. Pretty much everything Kathy had mentioned earlier on. So there's a lot of different lenses that we can look at simply because of the wealth of information we have. I think that's it in terms of time. Ellen, over to you.
Wow, what a great presentation. I just really want to thank Kathy and Asad, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you do have more questions and you'd like to send them in by email, please do so. Of course, you will receive a direct link to today's recorded presentation via email. Be on the lookout for that next week. And once again, there are some handouts in the event console, so go ahead and download those in the meantime. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.